we're about to have one of the rock and roll stars, before I say energy, I'll say of economics. We've got Michael Simmons, the economics editor of The Spectator. I had the pleasure of sitting down with Michael for an hour last week. It's out at the moment on the Wolf Power Club podcast about the alternative energy budget, and we are sure they're listening to it in Westminster now, doing their final edits before a big week. But we also have another rock and roll star, someone who has formed arguably the most well-known energy company in the UK, but not just the UK. They're doing solutions for everything from buying of crypto to sorting out your storage and charging of cars. So please, can we welcome to the stage Spectator's economics editor, Michael Simmons, but one of our keynotes today, the founder, the CEO of Octopus Energy, Greg Jackson.
Hi, everyone. Hope you're enjoying the Energy Summit so far. Thanks, Alex, for the introduction. I'm Mike Simmons, Economics Editor at Spectator, and of course, you all know Greg Jackson, CEO and founder of Octopus. Greg, just before we came on stage, we were talking about the fact that Ed Miliband says that the reason energy prices are still so high and are in fact increasing is because of the gas market. But that's just not true, is it?
I think there's some truth in the statement that electricity prices in the UK are still largely set by gas. Maybe it's worth just spending 30 seconds on how that works. A lot of us know the basics, but if I give a bit of detail, I think it really helps explain some of the issues we currently face. Every half hour, there's an auction in the UK where every electricity generator submits their bid to generate electricity. The system operator, who's in charge, ranks those prices and takes the amount of electricity we need and draws the cut-off line. And whichever is the most expensive unit to make it through in that auction sets the price that everyone will get paid. So you may have bid, 5 pence a kilowatt hour, but if someone made it through at 15 pence, you're getting paid 15. So there's a lot of economic rent in there. When all our electricity came from coal and gas, that kind of wasn't too bad because the input costs were broadly the same, so it was a very flat curve. There wasn't a lot of economic rent. Today, when we've got highly variable technologies, from wind and sun to different kinds of gas generation, a bit of nuclear, we've got interconnectors connecting to the continent, and then on top of that, you've got batteries that go both ways. That system really, really is now creating some very expensive electricity for the whole country, despite the fact that sometimes the majority of the generation is very cheap. But worse than that, there's a second stage, because they do the first stage without reference to geography. So once they've decided all the people are going to get paid, they then look at a map and work out that some of them are not going to be able to get their electricity to market because of grid congestion, but they're going to get paid anyway because they won the auction. And then they go and find somebody else that can generate to fill the gap. And by definition, they're even more expensive because they didn't make it through the auction. So you've got this kind of perverse, like Groundhog Day every half hour when there's a bunch of people getting told they're going to get paid, and they don't generate, we pay someone else. That secondary market is now occasionally transacting more money than the primary market. So you've just got a totally broken system, even before we get to some of the decisions we talk about in a minute. But I think, so the first thing is, in that auction, gas does often set the price. And by the way, it will dominate the secondary market. But of course, gas costs have been coming down. In fact, the latest price cap, we've seen the price of gas, cost of gas to households, is finally dropping. But the cost of electricity has continued to go up. So that's only part of the answer. The big thing that's happening on electricity bills is they're just a dumping ground for policies, for boondoggles, and a whole load of fixed costs that mean that on the current trajectory, even if the wholesale price of electricity goes to zero, our bills won't go down.
How can that be? I mean, what are the worst examples of these regulatory costs, policy costs that are added on?
Yeah, I'll pick out a couple of examples in a second, but I think there's a general disease in electricity, which is you'll keep hearing this phrase, only. Because basically, like a network company go, oh, this only adds £20 to bills. And another company go, oh, this only adds 60. And then there'd be a government policy, it only adds 40. And if you've ever run a company, you know, like the job of the CFO is to relentlessly squeeze out all of those little things, because collectively, those little things are the ones that kill you. And so in our case, what have we got at the moment? We've committed £22 billion, I think, to carbon capture and storage, which is ridiculous. Just to be absolutely clear, it will do nothing for emissions. It's not particularly efficient. It hasn't really worked anywhere in the world. It's not an export industry. No one else wants it. It just makes electricity more expensive. Frankly, if you want to decarbonize, you care about emissions, you'd make electricity cheap, because using electricity to power cars has lower emissions than petrol cars, even if all of the electricity came from unabated gas. So things like that, like 10 or 20 years ago, when people were thinking maybe this would be the future, it was fair enough. But all of the innovation and experimentation has shown that's not a path worth taking. We should just abandon it. And then, I don't know, today, the total assets, that's the electricity networks and grids, the total value of that asset base in the UK, I think, is 31 billion. It's set to be 87 billion by 2031 on the current policies. All of that is stuff we have to pay for on our bills. And what we need to do is say, look, again, there are now technologies that mean we could probably halve the future grid build-out and still meet our demand needs. And I think continually locking in policies that have been in development for years or even decades, rather than revisiting them, underlies a lot of this kind of dynamic. And the problem is, every time we lock in a new piece of infrastructure for 20 years that we didn't need, we've lost the ability to bring bills down for 20 years.
I wonder if you could talk a bit about the potential benefits to bills from digitalization. I mean, obviously, you've got your Kraken system. Tell us how that can bring bills down.
Forever, electricity has been a commodity where sometimes we've got loads of it, and other times we haven't got very much. And so in the old days, we had Economy 7 as an overnight tariff, typically to soak up cheap nuclear power by heating people's homes. In today's world, electricity is more variable than ever. So regardless of whether you like them or not, we have tons of wind farms, we have tons of solar farms, we've still got a reasonable amount of nuclear, and we'll connect us to other countries. And what it means is that every half hour, we've got times when we've got absolutely abundant electricity. There's so much of it, we pay industrial users to get rid of it, and we pay generators to turn off. There's other times when there's a lot less available and the price spikes a lot as we kick in every form of backup generation, or we'll compete for electricity through the interconnectors from other countries. And yet, on the consumer side, we typically have very, very flat pricing. And the assumption in electricity has always been, demand was exogenous. It's going to be what it's going to be. That assumption came about when light bulbs were 60 watts or 100 watts, and now they're 1 or 2 watts. When TVs were 600 watts, and now they're 30 watts. So at one time, all electricity usage, very high loads, were unshiftable. No one's going to turn their lights off just to save a few p. But today, the big demand for electricity, things like charging an electric car, is totally and utterly shiftable. You've got a battery that holds 300 miles of range. The typical commute is 11 miles. So you're totally comfortable if your car charges automatically at 8 p.m. or 10 p.m. or midnight or 4 in the morning, or indeed at midday on a sunny day, as long as you're getting the very, very cheapest power. So there's huge opportunities now in today's system for both households and industrial users to get super cheap power at the times it's abundant. But typically, again, our system is largely set up, the more fixed costs we're adding in, many of them to flatten the price curve, the dramatically less opportunity we have to access those very cheap power prices. Now, by the way, one policymaker in Whitehall said to me, look, I just want to do my washing when I do my washing. I don't care about the time. And I was like, that's totally cool. You can absolutely do that. But if there are people who save up their washing for windy and sunny days and save a few quid in doing it, they're making the system more efficient for everybody else. And it's no different than supermarkets. No one thinks it's wrong that a supermarket prices stuff to clear rather than throwing it away. No one thinks it's wrong that they have introductory offers when they got a new product. And consumerizing electricity enables us to push prices down. And to be really clear, this isn't about rationing. In fact, it's the exact opposite. Rationing is when we're told we can't have it. This is about saying, giving some people an absolute bargain to use it at the right times. I mean, there's more for everyone else all the rest of the time. And it's totally down to personal choice.
What about some of the models used in other countries? I mean, forgetting the politics for a moment, is there things we can learn from China, the Middle East?
Well, I think, first of all, there's one, for example, there was a fairly high-profile campaign that I was pushing hard on introducing zonal pricing, changing the way the back-end market works to eliminate a lot of the waste I talked about at the beginning. The northeast of the US has 12,000 different pricing zones they call nodes, and it enables much better optimization of the system. We've got one for the whole country, and it creates a lot of this inefficiency. So around the world, you've got different market structures, which enable markets to be more efficient. And that's not really about renewables. It's just the fact that today we've got the digital technology to optimize it. It's not just about household use or even business use, but things like large-scale batteries. The cost of batteries 12 years ago was $1,000 a kilowatt hour. No, it doesn't matter, just remember $1,000 12 years ago. Last year it was $100, so it's fallen by 10x in 12 years. The cheapest on the market this year is $62, so that's nearly 20x in 12 years. And then CATL, the world's biggest battery company, has just announced they're going into production with batteries that are going to be half that again. So as an example, these batteries will only work if you really efficiently if you digitize the grid so they know when to charge and discharge. But we should be clear, this isn't any longer expensive boondoggles. I mean, these are now astonishingly efficient, super cheap ways of meaning that maybe you can spend $1 million on batteries and avoid $10 million of new grid. That's a very, very good thing. In fact, I think if you want to get your head around electricity and all these discussions about grid build-out, first of all, we hear about demand growth. And the reality is demand has been falling in electricity. And if prices keep going up, I can't see demand taking off the way it should. Secondly, new demand, things like electric vehicles, doesn't add to peak loads. In fact, it reduces peak loads. It means you need less new infrastructure. And that's because in electricity, the determinant of infrastructure is every bit of wire has to carry the maximum load, even if it only happens for a few seconds a year. So if you can reduce the maximum load by, for example, using electric vehicles or batteries to shift consumption, you just don't need as much infrastructure. And the last thing on this kind of build-out stuff is I mentioned the prices of batteries there. As a reminder, the cheapest batteries in the world at the moment are $62, and they keep falling. The plan for the UK grid build-out assumes batteries are going to be $350 in 2030. That is 6 times more than they are now, and the price is dropping. So one of the problems we've got is we keep setting policies based on what's happening 10 years ago to be built in 10 years' time, and we're missing out. We're spending a fortune because we're not grabbing these innovations. It's like building shopping centers just as the internet's been invented. Now, you mentioned China. Look, I'm not here as the ambassador for China or anything, right? China, in many ways, is not always a good actor in our world, and there are many reasons to be concerned about things like cyber threats. But we have to say that electrification, alongside maybe AI, but electrification is kind of the global megatrend of this decade, really. China's gone from 10% of its economy being electric to 34%, and it's accelerating. We've been stuck at 20 to 25% in the UK, Europe, and the US. China's gone from 5% of clean energy patents to 75% of all the clean energy patents in the world. And Chinese innovation in solar means that solar panels are now 50 times cheaper than they were 20 years ago and keep getting cheaper. Electric vehicles are now roughly price parity with petrol, even in the West. In China, they're way cheaper. China's planning on no petrol stations by 2045. Now, a lot of people might say, look, China's kind of playing to its strengths. Well, the US is playing to its strengths. It's got fossil fuel reserves, oil and gas. So drill, baby, drill makes sense. And China's playing to its strengths. It doesn't have so much oil and gas, so it's electrifying.
Heck of a lot of coal, though.
Well, we're on to, okay, yeah, let's touch that. But first of all, just on this one, like electrification. By the way, remember, I'm not a China fan. I'm just saying, you've got to know what's going on in the world if you're going to make your decision sensibly. The difference between electrification and fossil fuels is that the technology of electricity are improving exponentially every year, and fossil fuels are mature. So the more you lock in a fossil fuel economy, the less you're going to be able to adopt the technologies, the cheap technology of electrification. And in a decade's time, we're going to be facing a China where everyone's driving everything from HGVs to cars as 100% electric near enough, being fueled by super cheap electricity, increasingly, by the way, from solar and wind. On coal, Chinese coal stations, a new build, obviously it's famous. It's roughly slowed to a trickle, and coal power stations have gone from 60% utilization to 48%. So even the ones they're building are not getting used very much, because 74% of all of the wind and solar being built in the world right now is being built in China. Right? Now, they're not doing it to nice people, it's just because it's increasingly cheaper. It's worth saying on coal, or indeed fossil fuels generally, I mentioned earlier, an electric car powered by 100% by electricity from fossil fuels has lower emissions than a petrol car. In many ways, we've focused on turning the 25% of our electricity from being coal and gas generated into renewable, forgetting about the 75% of the economy that's not electricity. And actually, what you want to do is have cheap electricity, electrify everything you can, and then you can change the power source as you grow, which is roughly what we're seeing from China. And I don't say that because I love them. I just say it because if you don't understand what's happening, you make bad policy.
Now, we're coming up against the clock, but we promised a Q&A, so let's take one question from the audience if anyone wants to. Charlie, I can't see, so if you want to take your pick.
Hi, Joanna Harding. It strikes me in Spain, when we get our electricity bill, there's a clear breakdown on the bill which says each piece of legislation and how much that piece of legislation ascribes to our electricity bill. So it's very clear, the breakdown between the cost of the production of the kilowatts and the legislation costs and infrastructure costs. My understanding is that Ofgem won't allow the power companies to provide that breakdown on the bill. And I think it would be very illuminating for people if the power companies pushed for it and people could actually see that so much of the bill isn't as a result of the raw material cost that goes into generating electricity.
First of all, I agree with the general thrust. Two quick thoughts. First one is, if anyone's an Octopus customer, you'll see that your bill comes as a PDF, that's the regulated document, attached to an email where we give you information in plain text that's much more readable. We could all do that. So the reality is, this isn't actually a regulatory issue. If the regulator makes everyone do it, that's fine, although it'll be incomprehensible. We could choose to do it. And I kind of like to. It's complicated because, for example, one of the reasons we're told that we've got so much wind power built off the coast of Scotland is it's windy there. And that is true. But it's also been cheaper typically to license seabeds off Scotland than it is off England. Now, that seabed license fee goes to the Treasury. It's very hard to work out how you handle these distortions that are even, before you've even got to the energy cost, that actually drive the real cost. And so internally, we are really trying hard to work out how do we make all this stuff clear. And I'd love to be the first to do it. But it's actually not the regulator, it's the companies.
Greg, thank you very much. I'm sorry to say we're out of time. We should have booked you in for double the amount of time because there's always so much to say on this. I think it's going to be a break next, but could you all join me in a round of applause for Greg Jackson?
Thank you.